Good afternoon and welcome to the Marianist Lecture, the first of 2024. The Marianist Lecture is sponsored by the Marianist Center of Hawaii, Chaminade University, and St. Louis School. This lecture fosters inclusive dialogue on Catholic thought and Catholic responsibility, gathering at the Kalaipahaku campus in a spirit of community and with a sense of place. This lecture was directed and planned for 25 years by Brother Dennis Schmitz. The Mackey Award for Catholic Thought, which will be presented to our speaker after the talk, is given to each presenter in honor of Father Robert Mackey, first president of Chaminade University. Father Mackey was an important voice in the civic and the religious community of Honolulu. The lecture series seeks to continue his commitment to Catholic thought and Catholic responsibility. This award honors scholarly, community, and faith leaders whose body of work advances the spirit, charism, and educational mission of the Society of Mary and the Marianist family. And so a very special welcome, especially to Dr. Lynn Babington, president of Chaminade University, Dr. Glenn Medeiros, president of St. Louis School, and Brother Ed Violet, the director of the Marianist Center of Hawaii. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Llewellyn Young, who is the superintendent for Catholic schools, with whom we work to promote and enhance Catholic education for this diocese. I'd also like to welcome Monsignor Gary Secor, who's here. Monsignor Secor is the Vicar General of the diocese. And we welcome all of those from the parishes with whom we work to prepare the next generation of Catholic leaders and Catholic laity. I'd also like to welcome any deacons from the diocese who are here, and all of those who are joining us online this afternoon. And for those of you who are on the East Coast, in the Midwest, it is 73 and breezy. And we welcome in a very special way Dr. Stephen Nyheisel, whom you will meet in just a moment. And so I'd like to continue the prayer that Kumu Kavika began. 3 short quotes and then a prayer. The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered founded on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. George Washington. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. John Kennedy. To preserve our blessed land, we must look to God. It is a time to realize that we need God more than He needs us. The time has come to turn to God and reassert our trust in Him for the healing of America. Our country is in need of and ready for a spiritual renewal. Today, we utter no prayer more fervently than the ancient prayer for peace on earth. President Ronald Reagan. And so we pray. Almighty God, ruler of all the peoples of the earth, forgive our shortcomings as a nation. Purify our hearts to see and love the truth. Give wisdom to our leaders and steadfastness to our people. And bring us at last to that fair city of peace, whose foundations are mercy, justice, and goodwill, of which you are the designer and builder through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. President Woodrow Wilson. And so I'd like to invite now Dr. Dustin Ragazza to introduce our speaker for this afternoon.
Aloha. Everyone associated with Marianist education, every student, administrator, alum, faculty person, and staff, has somehow been enriched by the gifts of Dr. Steve Nyheisel. For his love of Marianist education, our community will bestow upon him one of our highest honors, the Mackey Award for Catholic Thought, a few moments after his lecture. A leader in Catholic education, he earned his MBA from Xavier University in Cincinnati, an MA in theology from Notre Dame, and a PhD in political science at Washington University in St. Louis. Prior to his teaching career, he held management positions at 2 Fortune 100 companies and served in many leadership capacities across a range of organizations. Appointed professor and chair of the political science department, he served at St. Mary's University in San Antonio for about 23 years. He then joined the University of Dayton and was founder of their nonprofit and community leadership graduate certificate program. 6 years later, he placed his talents at the service to the national level, serving 4 years as the executive director of the Association of Marianist Universities. As executive director, he took it as his task to make Father Chaminade's vision of education palpable to all who call a Marianist university home. In one of his many reflections on a charism, he wrote, quote, "Blessed Chaminade noted that the essential is the interior, and it is at the interior where the understanding of teaching as a vocation resides. It is about the inner reflection and spiritual understanding of the how and the why we do what we do when we teach, and why we have committed our lives to this particular craft. It is about making meaning of our work lives and the contribution our craft makes to the lives towards the students and society." Armed with a lifetime of leadership skills and a deep sense of vocation, he conducted research that led him to collaborate with Brother Ed Violet in articulating and publishing The Characteristics of a Marianist Administration in 2009. This document complements The Characteristics of Marianist Education, co-authored with Brother Tom Giardino and others, which I'm glad to say serves as the bedrock for the university's strategic plan. A recipient of multiple awards for teaching excellence, an author of more than 40 publications, a sought-after public speaker and presenter of leadership development seminars, he continues to offer himself to his community and nonprofit causes in his new hometown of Austin, Texas. We welcome Steve back home to our community, to refresh his long relationships with old friends, to build new relationships with younger generations, and to present his lecture entitled God and Democracy, Catholic Perspectives on the American Experiment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Nyheisel.
Thank you so very much. It's great to be here from the mainland in February. Where else in the United States can one enjoy in such abundance and variety Spam? I mean, come on. A few years ago, I was here, went to the grocery store, and I'm going down the aisles, and it's going, you know, sodas, popcorn, chips, and then you go down, there's baked goods, and all of a sudden, Spam. The whole aisle is Spam. And you have all of this variety, and it's all glittering, all shining off the cans, et cetera. I said, wow, this really is paradise, isn't it? Let me, with that wonderful introduction, totally undeserved, let me give my thanks. I first want to thank Dr. Lynn Babington for her gracious hospitality. More than that, though, for her strong and dynamic and inspired leadership at this important university. Ed Brink, who's Vice President for Mission and Rector, who's been a pillar of Marianist education for many, many years. Brother Ed, thank you And a very, very special thank you to Father Martin Salma, former Provincial Superior of the Marianist Province of the United States, who invited me to give this lecture. I name Father Marty most specifically, not only to give a name to my gratitude, but also to let you know who to blame in case this doesn't go real well today. Because I'm just here for the spam. So, I'm good already. I'm good. Our story begins in 1787 in Philadelphia. It's hot, oppressively hot. It's bug infested. But the city's abuzz, not only because of the swarming flies, but because the Constitutional Convention is meeting all summer long. This is their second attempt at forming a government. The Articles of Confederation, which were signed and passed in 1777, were not strong enough, not rich enough, not binding enough to bring these 13 countries together. And that is not a misstatement. It was literally like bringing 13 countries together. They had their own currencies, they had their own trade regulations, they had their own constitutions, they had their own cultures. Maybe not exactly analogous to the European Union getting together after World War II, but not very far off. So the task was huge to bring these countries, states that have been independent for 150, some 200 years together. But maybe the best way to capitalize what happened in that summer in 1787 is from the great storyteller, great American storyteller, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And he often liked to recount the story of on September 17th, the day that the founders signed the Constitution, he was leaving the Pennsylvania State House, which is now we call Independence Hall, and he was walking down Chestnut Street to his home. And he was stopped by a woman shopkeeper. And again, the city had been abuzz for months about what was going on in that building, because of the flies and the bugs, they had to put up drapes over the windows, so people really didn't know what was going on. So she said, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he said, "Well, madam, a republic, if you can keep it." What Franklin and all the founders understood, because they were classically educated and great readers of history, that the shelf life of a democratic republic is relatively brief. In the I'm not an anthropologist, but in the 6,000 to 8,000 year history of settled human life, maybe 800 to 900 of those years, people have lived under democratic republic governments. About 500 years for the Roman Republic, maybe 200 years prior to that, the Athenian democracy, and of course our democracy. So that's one way to measure, but if you measure the number of human lives who actually lived under a free democratic republican government, it's a fraction. It's a fraction of people who lived. Most people, of course, their lives were governed by kings and monarchs and caliphs and pashas and shoguns and elders and priests and popes. And so the founders understood very clearly what they were doing and the kind of experiment that they were engaged in. Because at that time, it was understood that no government could stand with free people self-governing, without a king, without a monarch. And so they understood that it required a certain amount, a certain kind of person in order to make it all work. Today, what I'd like to do in two parts is to tell the story of the great American democratic experiment from the point of view of American Catholics. We could tell this story from a lot of different perspectives, right? We could tell it from the African American perspective. We could tell it from the Asian American perspective. We could tell it from the female perspective. We could tell it from the Hawaiian perspective. We could tell it from many different perspectives. Today, we'd like to concentrate on American Catholics. In two parts, and then I'll have a brief coda at the end to conclude, but in two parts. One is the lived experiences of American Catholics over these some 250 years. We're approaching the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to go a little before that as well. But nevertheless, what has shaped the American Catholic life, and how have American Catholics shaped American democracy? Now, just to qualify that point, and I want to be very clear, the experience of American Catholics has been uneven for different groups, right? Hispanic American Catholics have a different perspective and have had a different experience than German American Catholics, et cetera. So what we're focusing on today is American Catholics as a group, as a whole, as a group. So that lived experience, I think, is important to articulate. And the second is I invite you into a look at the overlap, the intersection, or at least the resonance between Catholic thought and American thought. We have 2,000 years of Catholic intellectual history. We have a good 250-some years of American Enlightenment theory. And to take a look at seeing, is there any similarities in there? Can we see where there might be some intersections? I am going to, also I need to tell you this so that you can tell me if I need to read a PowerPoint. I don't know if in the back you're going to be able to read. So let's agree on this. If, especially those in the back, when I get the slides and you would like me to read the slide, please raise your hand. I'll just take that as not a question. We'll save those for the end. But I'll take that as a point of conduct, and I'll read it for you. Because I did not intend to read these. These were just going to be background as I spoke. So I want to tell you that right now. So once again, let's take a look at the contours of the lived American Catholic experience. Very early on, there was a question of, can one be American and Catholic? American and Catholic. And I think the depth of that question should become a little clearer as we move through this. In other words, can one be both a part of and engaged in a democratic, social, political, economic environment, and be loyal to what was perceived, of course, as a foreign power, And I'll make that part of it clear in just a little bit. In 1608, Captain George Kendall, who was one of the leaders of the Jamestown colony, which had been founded, of course, in 1607, first permanent English settlement in what was to become the United States. In 1608, Captain George Kendall was executed. And he was executed for one reason and one reason only. They discovered he was Catholic. He was a crypto-Catholic. And that was against the law in Jamestown. Throughout the 13 colonies, beginning in 1607 and running well into the 1820s, there were anti-Catholic laws on the books of almost every colony, although we will have an exception. In Virginia, for example, even after they started to liberalize their laws against Catholics, a priest could be arrested if he was discovered to be a priest working in Virginia. In Massachusetts, they threatened executions of priests who might be caught residing at Mass. What the early colonies showed, they mirrored the religious controversies in England at the time. And if any one of you remember, of course, the controversies of those times from your history, it was back and forth between Protestant domination and Catholic domination in the crown. And so the colonies reflected mostly, because again, they were Protestants. The Protestants who came to what was to become the United States were dissenters from the Church of England for the most part. So they were the most Protestant of Protestants. And that's why they couldn't abide any Catholics in their land. They had laws such that, and again, this is ran around across the colonies, but let's just use the two most important, Massachusetts in the north and Virginia in the middle states. Catholics could not vote. Of course, then Catholics could not hold office. Catholics could not own property. And Catholics could not teach in the schools. There was one exception, and that was the colony of Maryland. In 1635, Charles I gives a charter to George Cecil, otherwise known as Lord Baltimore, in honor of the king, in honor of his wife, Henrietta Marie, a former princess of France, because she was Catholic, and Charles wanted to honor her Catholicism, hence is why it was named Maryland. It was not founded for Catholics, but it was founded in order to allow religious tolerance within the colony. The Catholics that began to come to Maryland, be able to prosper in Maryland, became among the largest landowners in Maryland. And this is going to play an important part in the American Revolution, which I'll come to in just a little bit. It was a very small but tight-knit Catholic community. They were generally well-educated Catholics, wealthy Catholics, as I mentioned, owned a lot of land. So they would have their own private chapels. They would allow priests to come and and the neighbors would come into those private chapels and they would have Mass there. The point being that even in tolerant Maryland, founded by a Catholic, Lord Baltimore, Catholics still had to remain a little bit below the radar. In 1649, there was the Act Concerning Religion passed in Maryland. And the Act Concerning Religion was about tolerance. It was a forerunner of Jefferson's Articles of Religious Liberty, which he wrote in the 1790s. It was a forerunner of that, and it generally said that all religions are tolerated in the state, in the colony of Maryland. But that had a short shelf life. That ended in 1688, because in 1688, the last Catholic king of England, James II, was deposed in the Glorious Revolution. And that is when the Puritans took over the colony of Maryland and again passed, this is a little bit later, but nevertheless, just to show the trajectory, by 1704, Maryland had on the books an act to prevent popery taught throughout this province. And so once again, even in Maryland, Catholics had to go underground. However, the seed had been planted. The seed had been planted. I think what helped the Catholic community to survive in Maryland was the fact that it was particularly wealthy and it was well-educated. And so they knew how to play the political system, so to speak. And probably the best example of that is a man named Charles Carroll. Charles Carroll was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence and the only Catholic to sign both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Charles Carroll was the wealthiest man in the 13 colonies. That helped. They could kind of overlook the fact he had made a bad choice in religion because he was so wealthy. But because of Charles Carroll and because of his cousin, John Carroll, who we'll come to in just a little bit, that the small Catholic community actually played a very prominent role in the Revolution. Charles Carroll helped bankroll it, as well as the other wealthy Catholics did, and George Washington made a special point to point them out and said that the Catholics in the Revolution were great patriots. Can you read that in the back? Can you see that a little bit? Oh, thank you. Well, so around 1780, so the Revolutionary War is not over yet, 1783, it's over. But the change is occurring for Catholics in the United States. War has, and you're going to hear this throughout this story, war has a way of of course, disrupting society and reconstructing society. And what the Revolutionary War did for American Catholics was to allow them to not only show their patriotism through their work in the Revolution, but also this was a time of religious tolerance because of the fact that France, Catholic France, had basically won the war for the United States. Had the French Navy not blocked Cornwallis from leaving Yorktown, the result of the American Revolution could have been very different. Or at least the war would have been prolonged so that public opinion, which was back and forth on the war, it wasn't like everyone was a great patriot. Public opinion could have changed, and therefore the war could have gone the other way. So there began to be this tolerance of Catholics, etc. Again, please don't misunderstand, the anti-Catholic laws stayed on the books in most of the colonies until the 1820s. But what it allowed to do, what this period 1780 to 1820, allowed American Catholics to do is develop an American model of the church. An American model of the church. Because the American Catholic community was pretty much off the radar of Rome. I mean, Rome had all kinds of major issues at the time, right? It was losing France by the late 1700s. So this little outpost of some wealthy landowning plantation owners in Maryland was not their concern. What it then allowed the church to do, as this quote from Archbishop John Carroll, S.J., cousin of Charles Carroll, first American bishop in the United States. In these United States, our religious system has undergone a revolution, if possible, more extraordinary than our political one. During this period, they developed a model of church which had the following characteristics. Number one, parishes would be controlled by lay trustees. Some of this is going to start to sound a little familiar. Controlled by lay trustees, because often the plantation owners would donate the land for a church, et cetera, et cetera. Number two, the lay trustees would choose the priests, the parish priests. Characteristic number three, the priests would elect the bishop. And John Carroll was elected by the priest as the first bishop. This was primarily in the Maryland area, a little bit into Philadelphia, if you want to follow up and read more about that story. I think the important characteristic to remember in this period is that at this time, it was not an immigrant church. The priests were not immigrant priests. The priests were American-born priests. Once again, serving a very tight-knit, well-educated, wealthy Catholic community. But they applied these democratic principles that they had learned through the American system of how to do church in that time. Well, then things start to change. This period of 1820 to 1920 I call conflict and accommodation. It's a long period, so I'd like to break it up in two parts for you. Let's start off with the early part of the 19th century. And I'll go ahead and read these, because maybe you won't be able to see them. This is Father Hecker, founder of the Paulists. In the union of Catholic faith and American civilization, a future for the church brighter than the past. What began to happen in the 1820s, well into the 1830s and 1840s, and probably most of you are familiar with this, was the first great wave of immigration. First mass immigration, especially from Ireland and Germany, of Catholics. And not only were these the great waves of Irish and German, predominantly Irish and German Catholics at the time, but they also brought their priests with them. And they also brought public displays of their religion with them. And what happened is they clashed. It was almost like a social tectonic plate clash between this mass immigration period of 20, 30 years before the Civil War and what Americans were trying to do. During this period, this early Federal Republic period, Americans were trying to establish an American identity. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans were trying to establish an American identity that was non-European. So they were especially distressed at all these Europeans coming to America, especially Catholic Europeans. Read the works of Hawthorne, read the essays of Thoreau and Emerson, the poetry of Longfellow, the paintings of Thomas Cole and the Hudson River School. It was all about what does it mean to be an American. One of the great phrases from an essay at that time, a letter from an American farmer, the great line was, "What is this American, this new man?" Sounds kind of a little echo of St. Paul there, but what is this American, this new man? So at the same time they were trying to develop this identity, there's coming in is a flood of immigrants, from Catholic immigrants especially, from Europe. At the same time, and again, this is what some of the Americans were concerned about, was the centralizing influence in Rome. As I mentioned earlier, of course, the church had gone through the very difficult times with losing France, all the other revolutions that were starting to happen, the 1848 revolution in Germany, all the revolutions that were happening, and so Rome started to centralize its power. So the message that the American Protestant community received was, here are these Irish and German immigrants, Catholic immigrants coming to America, they're bringing their priests, and is this not a foreign power? Because remember, still at this time, the Pope had papal states, the Pope had armies, the Pope was one of the last seemingly absolute monarchs in Europe, and American Protestants didn't understand that and didn't accept that and didn't like that at all. So that's why you started to see signs, right, pop up in Boston shops, no Irish and dogs allowed. Help wanted, no Irish need apply. Irish, that word Irish, we'll come back to it later, becomes a code word for Catholic in America, a derogatory, pejorative code word for Catholics in America. So the response by the American community was nativism. The Native American Party, otherwise known as the Know-Nothings, because it was a rather secretive party. And they were anti-Catholic and very assertive and often aggressive with that anti-Catholicism. In Philadelphia, New York, Boston, convents were burned, Catholic schools were burned down, seminaries were attacked, etc. Because once again, they saw it as a threat to what it means to be American. Earlier, I mentioned that question of, can one be American and Catholic? The American Native Party said no. Native American Party said no. You cannot be American and Catholic. You can be one or the other. Father Hecker, but I should mention also what the Native American Party did was a series of literary propaganda. And of course, their slogan was rum, because Catholics, they said, of course, drink too much, Romanism, and rebellion. Because also those Catholic communities were associated with rebellion back in Europe. Father Hecker was one who very early on thought, what I want to do in my ministry is create a bridge between American civilization and Catholic communities. So he went out and spoke often about, he tried to teach the spirit of American democracy to Catholic communities and tried to teach to Protestant communities that Catholicism was not a threat to the American Protestant community. By the way, just as an aside, I should mention that the Paulists have put Father Hecker up for canonization. So if at the end of this lecture you think you learned anything, call your favorite Paulist priest and tell him you think you've witnessed a miracle. And so in the name of Father Hecker, because they want to start keeping count of these. So again, the early part of the 19th century was conflict. This two social, political, religious tectonic plates colliding, issuing out violence, issuing out strife. And then once again, what happens? War. Once again, war has this way of reconstructing society. The Civil War occurs. And in the Civil War, there were many Irish brigades, Catholic Irish brigades, many Catholic German brigades. who fought heroically at Chancellorsville and Spotsylvania, in the wilderness, all the major battles of the Civil War, and we're honored for that. And what it taught the non-Catholic comrades, which they worked with, was, hey, we're all in this together. You are patriots. You love this country. You're fighting for the same cause we are. So there was this kind of coming together for a while because of that reason in the war. But also, and I think more importantly, what happened in the late 19th century was industrialization. The country started to build greater industries, started to need more workers. Where are you going to get more industrial workers? Immigration. So in the late 19th century, what we had was a mass immigration of more Catholics, but now from Southern and Eastern Europe. And they were accommodated into the economic system in part, and accepted into the economic system in part, because the economic system needed those workers very, very much. We also had at that time the urbanization, and this was the beginning of those urban Catholic national parishes that tended to be very close-knit and took care of each other very, very well and started to help people mobilize. I'll come back to that story. Also in the late 19th century, I mentioned early on how a lot of the states kept anti-Catholic laws on the books. By this middle to late part of the 19th century, voting rights among all the states started opening up for more and more people. And so what we saw emerging by the end of this period was the Catholic vote. The Catholic vote. Politicians started to recognize that by appealing to working class, primarily working class urban Catholics, they could win elections which they otherwise might not be able to win. And so that too developed this sense of, well, Catholics are American, Catholics can be American. I think if I could give you a symbol that really would summarize this last part, the accommodation part of the American Catholic story, is New St. Patrick's Cathedral. So there's Old St. Patrick's, which is Lower East Side, still exists, lovely church. But in 1858, Archbishop John Hughes, Irish-born Archbishop John Hughes, decides to build New St. Patrick's Cathedral. And where did he build New St. Patrick's Cathedral? On 5th Avenue and 50th Street. And who lived near 5th Avenue and 50th Street? The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Morgans, the Fricks, the Mellons. So I must think that Archbishop had some kind of maybe holy passive aggressiveness when he saw that spire go up and dominate that whole neighborhood over all of those mansions of the people who represented the people who would oppress his Irish people. I think that is a symbol of the accommodation and the entry into American life for American Catholics. Now, please don't get me wrong. Nativism continued. Whenever there would be a major accomplishment by the American Catholic community, there would be a response, as there often is, by the nativist community, violence or prejudice of some kind, etc. I have another sidebar. I like this one, being a graduate of Notre Dame. There are legends as to how Notre Dame got the name Fighting Irish, and I think the university has done the best it can to try to, whittle them down and make them look kind of good. One legend is that Father Corby, who was a priest, a Holy Cross priest, was a chaplain at Bull Run, I believe it was, and on the campus of Notre Dame, there's a statue of him standing on a rock pressing the troops. So people say, well, the reason we're called the Fighting Irish at Notre Dame is because it took it from Father Corby, who came president of Notre Dame, and he wanted us to be the Fighting Irish like those troops he blessed. That's not the version I prefer. The version I prefer is the Notre Dame football team in the early 1900s played public schools, and they used to be yelled at, "Hey Irish, hey Irish." So many of them were German. But they'd be yelled at, they'd be called Irish, because that was a derogatory name for a Catholic. And so they turned it around and said, well, okay, fine, you can call us that, but we're going to be the Fighting Irish. So that's a sidebar, but that's the story I prefer to go with. Much, much more better. All right, moving along. So the next period up to the present time I call assimilation and ascendancy. And the early part of the 20th century being the assimilation piece, and the second part being the ascendancy piece. I'll read the quote from Kennedy, because I'm sure you can't see it when I get to the second part, the ascendancy piece. Well, as I mentioned, by the early 20th century, the Catholic vote became very, very important, especially to urban politicians and the urban machines, political machines. I don't think we should underestimate the power of Catholic parishes in helping to grow the Catholic vote and in order to help people to engage more fully in the political system. Perhaps the pinnacle of this was the Al Smith election. If you remember your American history, Al Smith was the first Catholic candidate. He was governor of New York, which says something in itself to be governor of New York, but Catholic, first presidential candidate to be Catholic of a major party. Of course, he was just absolutely trounced by Herbert Hoover in the 1928 election. But that was the beginning, right? The kind of beginning of Catholics more and more engaging at a national level in American politics. We have to remind ourselves, though, that during Smith's campaign, the KKK was very active in anti-Catholic activities around the country. And so once again, as in any social movements, it's like currents. Think of the ocean or think of rivers, undercurrents and currents and waves hitting each other. There's a constant back and forth between these opposing forces. And certainly throughout those centuries, it was true with Catholics and the American nativist forces. Well, once again, I have to say, war changes things. War changes things. In the middle, of the 20th century almost, we have World War II. And one of the fruits of World War II was the GI Bill. And what the GI Bill helped all Americans, but especially helped working class American Catholics to buy homes in the suburbs, to get an education, to move out from the urban national parishes and start to assimilate out into the larger environment and larger population. Catholic colleges and universities started growing at a very rapid rate because of that, because of the GI Bill. And once again, I think because of the suburbanization of Catholics, there started to be a greater understanding between Catholics and non-Catholics in America. Because what we're starting to see fade, I'll come back to it, but we're starting to see fade is the Catholic vote. That's an important piece of this, and again, I have to come back to it. But in September 12th of 1960, John Kennedy had to go, and some of us remember this well from history. John Kennedy had to go to Houston to a meeting of Protestant ministers because Protestant ministers around the country were telling their parishioners, you cannot vote for a Catholic. Catholicism is a foreign power. Catholicism is about superstition. We are a Protestant nation. Yes, we have Catholics here, but we can never have a Catholic president, so you must not ever elect a Catholic president, never vote for one. So Kennedy had to go and make his case to this group of Protestant ministers in Houston on September 12, 1960, and I'll read this to you. This is what he said. I believe in America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the people who might elect him. This is the great entree. This is the great entrance into national politics by a major American candidate. Now, out of 66 million votes cast, Kennedy won by over 118,000. Only 118,000 votes. Scholars estimate that his Catholicism cost him about 1.5 million votes because of the anti-Catholic prejudice at work. Jump forward to 1984. Some of us do remember this well. Mario Cuomo, governor of New York, makes a speech at Notre Dame where he talks about, again, that as a Catholic politician, he is Catholic, but he's not going to allow his Catholicism to overrule his duty to his constituents and to the Constitution. So what do we start to have happening now in the middle of the 20th century? We start to move away from American Catholicism as a target, that because of the assimilation, now American Catholicism starts to turn in on itself. And we start to see within the church conflict between different groups and different perspectives. Because it's no longer that psychological thing where we are, as all Catholics, are under attack. Catholics are doing well. By the 1980s, the Catholic vote no longer became the bellwether vote. When you watch the election this fall, Catholic vote probably won't even be mentioned because there really isn't a Catholic vote anymore because Catholics split their vote 50-50. 50% basically vote Democratic, 50% vote Republican. And now the bellwether vote is the white evangelical vote. That's the tipping point vote. Well, we're getting to the end of this part of the story of the American Catholics in the United States. So let's take a little look at how well American Catholics have done. So American Catholics represent, right now, 23% of the population. They represent 28% of the seats in Congress. American Catholics represent 30% of the governorships. American Catholics represent 77% of the Supreme Court. And Catholics represent 100% of the president. That's a statistical joke, of course, right? Very small sample size. American Catholics, on the economic front, American Catholics represent 30% of American CEOs. Again, 23% of the population, 30% American CEOs. And American Catholics, the average salary, average income of a Catholic, American Catholic, is 10% higher than the US average. So all of this is to say that American Catholics, through this period of criminalization in the 16 and 1700s, through conflict and accommodation in the 19th century, has now really become very prosperous, well off, and significantly represented in the halls of power throughout the country. And yet, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., he was the chronicler of the Kennedy family, and he was the one that came up with the idea of Camelot, etc., won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, 1,000 Days, about the Kennedy, first Kennedy administration. And he said, he wasn't a Catholic himself, but he said the last acceptable prejudice in the United States will be anti-Catholic. The last acceptable prejudice will be an anti-Catholic prejudice. And people said, oh, no, Catholics are. So just as a reminder of that, May of last year, of 2023, and some of you may have remembered this, I especially remember it because I'm a Xavier University grad. Bob Huggins, the coach of the West Virginia University basketball team, former coach of the University of Cincinnati basketball team, which is a major rival to Xavier University, on a talk show in Cincinnati, referred to the Xavier fans as Catholic homophobic slur. Catholic, you fill in what he said. Now, he was reprimanded by his university. They took $1 million away from his salary. That still left him several million to play with. He had to give $200,000 donation to the Xavier University Center of Faith and Culture. He had to do some LGBTQ plus training, et cetera, et cetera. He eventually lost his job. But that was bad enough. But what I think maybe was worse was that Bill Cunningham, the host of that show, laughed when Huggins used that Catholic homophobic slur and said, isn't Bob Huggins great? And he was not reprimanded. iHeart Radio never came out with a statement. They just let it go. That's an example of what some people refer to as a latent anti-Catholic sentiment in America. And one more. In June of last year, the LA Dodgers hosted Pride Night. And at Pride Night, they honored the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Now, let me just right out front say, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence do wonderful, healing, caring work for AIDS patients. I'm going to repeat that. They do loving, healing, caring work that we should all honor for AIDS patients. But how they do it, how they raise money, how they do what they do is, again, Sisters of Perpetual. They mock Catholic nuns and they mock Catholic imagery. They have the First Amendment right to do that. I defend their right to do that because by defending their right to do it, I'm defending my right to practice my faith the way I wish. My problem wasn't with them. I know now I'm on a soapbox, but this one annoyed me. It was with the LA Dodgers, an iconic institution that decided that they were going to give this organization pride of place at Pride Night. Pride of place. They were going to be the main group. Now, there was a bit of controversy. Then they said, no, you can't come, sisters. And then there was backlash against that because there was some Catholic groups that said, don't do that. LA Dodgers say, okay, we won't do that. Sisters, you can't come. And then there was backlash to that. So then basically the LA Dodgers had to pick their prejudice. And they decided to then allow the sisters to come. But once again, what that suggests is, I can't imagine if a group of white men put on blackface and parodied black ministers, that the LA Dodgers would have allowed that? Of course, I certainly hope not. That's terrible. Or if a group of men, Anglo-Saxon men, dressed up like Middle Eastern teachers and carried pictures of the prophet, which of course is blasphemy, would the LA Dodgers have allowed that? So despite the gains that American Catholics have made through all these years, is Schlesinger right? Will anti-Catholic prejudice be the last acceptable American prejudice? I'll leave that for you. We'll leave that for you to ponder. Well, on to our second part. I know I'm pressing time here. So that's the lived historical experience part. Let's now look at the thought part. Is there a way to align American thought, American Enlightenment thought, and the Catholic intellectual tradition? And I'll move a little bit more quickly here in the interest of time, but I want to give you some aspects for your consideration on where that might be the case. America is a creedal nation. Catholicism is a creedal religion. That is, what unites us is not blood or geography or culture. It's a shared set of beliefs, both American and Catholic. I'd like to do now a little scriptural exegesis on the Declaration of Independence to see where we might be able to find some common cause, some commonality. I will get right to it. So, the first one, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What Jefferson is invoking is natural right, natural law theory. Natural law theory, of course, started with Aristotle and the Greeks, developed metaphysically by Aquinas, and then carried on to John Locke. But what Jefferson did was he used the Thomistic, the Aquinas' basis of natural law theory in developing this part of the American Declaration of Independence. Self-evident, that is, we know these and we can assent to them both through reason and by divine revelation. Goes on that all men are created equal. Our understanding of equality is informed by St. Paul. Pre-Christian societies believed in a natural inequality. They too believed in natural law principles, natural law theory, but they interpreted it as natural inequalities. It was after St. Paul that thought turned, Judeo and Christian thought turned to focus on natural equalities. Why? Because in Galatians 3:28, you all know this part, there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. Everyone is equal in Christ. So if everyone is equal in Christ, then the natural follow-up is that everyone is equal in positive law, in government law, in human-made law. Once again, that was a radical contribution and a radical shift into how we saw things. Christianity changed the dimension of human identity. It now said that everyone was equal, everyone, no matter, again, what category, ethnic, gender, whatever category they would have been in. Then it goes on to, the creed goes on to, that they are endowed by their Creator. So again, endowed, spark of God, by their Creator. Jefferson didn't write by the Creator. He wrote by their Creator. Why am I emphasizing that? Because that establishes a personal relationship between every individual and the Creator. They're endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. Unalienable means they can't be taken away, but also I can't give my rights away. They're endowed by God. I can't trade them away. I can't give them away. To do so, I lose my human identity. I lose my dignity. Often, I would teach American politics, I'd always ask the question, so from where do our rights come? And I normally get the answer, and they weren't students. Anyone I would ask where I get our rights, they'd say, well, the government. I'd say, oh, no, please. No. If rights come from government, they can be taken away. Our rights, again, were endowed and are unalienable. They cannot be taken away. That among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And here, once again, we call on St. Paul to say from Galatians 5:1, for freedom Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit to the yoke of slavery. So once again, we do not need to go simply to the Enlightenment to find basis for the American creed. We go back into Christianity. Architecture of government. James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So in the Constitution, what the founders did was they created a framework for government. In other words, the rules, regulation. You can even use the metaphor of a steel frame with the different beams running through and the conduits. This is how the government's going to act. One of the major ways they did that, of course, is through the system of checks and balances. We have a very intricate system of checks and balances. You are, of course, aware of the three branches of government, and those are checks. But it's much, much more than that. It includes the free press. It includes local and state governments in that system of checks and balances. It includes you and I as free citizens in that system of checks and balances. And all of that is the founders' response to Genesis chapter 3 and the fall and the imperfect human nature. And they knew, being good Puritans, and certainly the grandsons and great-grandsons of Puritan stock, that people just were sinful and that had to be attempted to be constrained. And that's how they did that with the system of checks and balances. The other part of the architecture of government is federalism. So federalism, you'll recall, is where we have two-tier level of government. We have the national government, and then we have the state government, because local governments are under the state government. So we have two. And for Catholics, that is well indicative of our application of the principle of subsidiarity, because it allows for people at local levels and different levels to be able to make their own decisions, because we want decision-making to be pushed down as far as possible. Civic culture. Two pillars of civic culture. One is individualism, and the other is community. Individualism is important to a democratic republican system because we are to be self-governed. We are to be self-governed. And once again, we look to St. Paul for inspiration and idea of individualism in American life. Because once again, he said that in Christ reveals God's presence in every believer. in every individual believer, that all of us have moral agency because of that. That is a necessary foundation for a democratic Republican government, that everyone is able to self-govern and be able to follow that rule. It detached this individualism idea, St. Paul's writings, and even in the gospel part in Matthew 12, 48 to 50, where Jesus says, well, they say, well, where's your brother and sisters, and who are your brother? And Jesus says, well, who follows me are my brothers and sisters. What that did was break down that paternalistic, family-based structure where people referred to the father for all decision-making. Now, of course, we understand there can be excessive individualism, and that's not good. But there can also be excessive community, and that's not good either. So nevertheless, we can turn to St. Paul, we can turn to writings in Scripture for the basis of American individualism. If you're interested in this extended look at this topic, I suggest a book to you called Inventing the Individual. Inventing the Individual. The author's name is Seidentop, S-E-I-D-E-N-T-O-P, where he writes a book tracing the idea of individualism from St. Paul through the early Christian writers and claiming it's Christianity which endowed to the world the idea of individualism. Community is critical, of course, to our work in the Catholic Church. De Tocqueville in 1831 came to the United States and wrote his book, Democracy in America. One of the main principles in that book was he called the United States a nation of joiners, because Americans just like to join groups, he said. They like to do things together. Now, he knew that wasn't because they liked each other necessarily, they might have, but it wasn't because they liked each other, it's because they had to in order to survive. You can't build your own barn. You can't bring in the crops. When your kids are sick, you can't bring all your crops. You need your neighbor to help you. So this idea of association and this idea of communities working together wasn't simply out of love and brotherhood, but it began that basis of working together. But community is the basis of our civil society. And our civil society, that's you and I, our civil society, the Catholic Church, all the churches, Habitat for Humanity, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that is civil society. It's free people, freely associating, organizing to address community needs. That's civil society. That is the basis of democratic Republican government. That is what keeps neighborhoods and communities healthy. That is what keeps democracy healthy. And all of that, individualism and community, leads to this, and here we are back to St. Paul. There is one body, but it has many parts. But all its many parts make up one body. E pluribus unum. Just this is Paul's mystical model of the church, and it's our, if I could say so, mystical model of national community. So just a brief conclusion. You'll remember we opened with Dr. Franklin saying it's a republic if you can keep it. What will allow us to keep it? Because once again, the founders would say, if he was here today, Franklin would say, don't take it for granted. Why should you be any different, America, from the Athenian democracy and the Roman Republic? There's no reason why you should continue to exist. So what makes it possible to exist? And I want to leave you with this final point. I'll read this for you because it's beautiful and you probably can't read it in the back. The enduring moral legacy of Christianity is the primacy of love. And love, I would argue, is the building block for good community and a good society. And so democracy is the best form of government for allowing us as civil society, as American Catholics, to express our values and to express our interests and to express what we want done in our society. This is Martin Luther King. This is from a letter from a Birmingham jail. If you have never read that, it's a treat. Please read it if you can. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Power without love is reckless and abusive. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. So here's my final point. Catholic Christianity is not a private hobby. It's a calling to build the city of God. And the city of God is best built on a foundation of love. And that, again, is a gift that the American Catholic community and other Christian communities, but our today is about American Catholics, that is gifted to American society. So it's a republic. Let's work to keep it. Mahalo.
So I'm Helen Turner. I'm a Marianist Educational Associate here at Chaminade and a member of the organizing committee. And I think you'll all agree, we did good this time, right? So I'd like to propose a thanks to you, Steve, for this lecture. I'm a relatively newly minted American and a Catholic. And what I heard today was something that spoke to American Catholicism as a heritage, as an inspiration, as an aspiration, as a fragile responsibility. So thank you again for your words today. And Steve has said that he would be happy to take some questions from our audience. And so I think we have time for a few questions. And I don't know if we have a microphone to move around or whether just to... Oh, great. So Andrew Anchetta, one of our grads at Chaminade, is going to bring a microphone round. And so please raise your hand if you have a question. And I'd like to invite Steve, after that well-earned break, back up to the podium to answer your questions. Thanks, Steve.
Anybody? So none of you and tell them you've seen a miracle happen?
Thank you so much for your talk. It was just really very both interesting and connecting for things that I've known about Irish. I'm Irish heritage. And what I'd like to ask you is there a set of books or are there some books that give some of this background? I've never heard it kind of put together like this, and I'd be interested.
Personally think still the best going. Kenneth Starr, the librarian from the state of California, he's just put out, not just, maybe 5 years ago, put out a 3-volume set. If you'd really like the whole, everything from Hispanic America into, but Jay Dolan, probably that book, Jay Dolan, The American Catholic Experience, would probably be the one you'd want to read. Yes? Uh-huh.
Okay. So I'm a co-member of the Sisters of Loretto from Kentucky, and they started with 3 women who came west from Maryland to western Kentucky around the Louisville area. And as you were talking, I've just gone through a year's kind of study on the history of the Sisters of Loretto, and I'm really curious about about the role that Catholic sisters played in the promotion of Catholicism through Catholic schools, through their teaching, but at that very critical time when there was still so much anti-Catholic feeling. And that's what I'm particularly interested in at this point. Thank you.
The hospitals, the schools, the nursing homes, everything that they established really was the foundation of the Catholic social services that we know today. So they were critical. There were times, of course, I mentioned earlier, when convents were burned down because they were at times easy targets. But also the sisters were able to thrive in ways maybe that some of the male ministries weren't able to do as easily, because as women, and let's just, in the 19th century, maybe the opposition would say, well, why bother about the women? They don't have power. They can't vote. They can't, so we'll just ignore the nuns. That's not to take away the heroic work, obviously, which they did, because they did. But I think that part, that nativist part, they were able to just get through probably a little bit better because of that reason. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good, someone else, yeah.
And I too want to thank you for your talk. Lots of different directions, lots of different questions, but I'll just ask one. And this is bringing it down to a specific historical reality that really doesn't exist anymore since the United States is an all-volunteer military now. But back in the day of World War II and Vietnam, which I remember much more than World War II, which I have no memory of, but I read a lot about it, is what happens when a person, let's talk about Catholics since that's what we're talking about tonight, conscientiously objects to taking part in a war, which happened in World War II and happened in Vietnam. And the wars were by and large supported by the Catholic hierarchy. I'd just be interested in your reflections about when Catholicism directly contradicts the national effort, and what your thoughts are on that quandary.
Very briefly, it just reflects, again, I would say, that idea that everyone is a moral agent and they have the ability to make those decisions, or the primacy of conscience, et cetera, and they have the ability to make those decisions. I think what's been wonderful about the Catholic experience is because of all the shapes it takes and all the contours it has. This word often isn't used, but the American Catholic community is a pluralistic community. You wouldn't hear or read that in the media, because the media, when they write about it, they often look at just either the hierarchy, what they're doing, or what Catholic lay people are doing in Africa, whatever. They don't realize the richness, et cetera. So I would only say that it just comes down, once again, to people's individual conscience.
Does a country, does a national entity have a right to put people in jail for their national consciousness or for their individual consciousness during wartime, for example?
I mean, they do. I mean, legally, right? I mean, yeah, legally they do, of course. Morally?
I'm asking you too many questions,
Oh, okay.
but what's the moral obligation of the national institution in, obviously the moral obligation of an individual to follow informed conscience is one thing,
right?
But it conflicts with the national work of war.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question clearly. Let's move on to another one. Come back to that. Someone else have a question? Yes.
I was just curious, the idea of the suburbanization and kind of the ending of the enclave, you can call it.
Right.
You could also see that track with maybe a decline in the strength of, or the unity of a church. How do you reinforce those things once you're no longer in the enclave? I mean, I see immigrant communities here from different parts of Polynesia have very, very strong linguistic and faith communities, and you wonder, as those generations go on, how does that not, degrade?
That's a good question, because I've asked myself that question, and a lot of people are asking in Catholic leadership are asking that question. Back when I was growing up, and for many people here, we grew up in what was called thick Catholic communities. Thick Catholic communities. In other words, that meant that you went to the school, and you played sports for the school, and your Boy Scout and Girl Scout troop was at the school, and so you saw your football coach at Mass on Sunday, you saw your den mother, and blah, blah. That's a thick Catholic community. And so therefore, when I went on, and others of us here would go on to Catholic high schools and Catholic colleges, we already had a formation and understanding, right? That is one of the great challenges. I don't have an answer. Is one of the great challenges for the church today. How do you build that kind of thick community where there are webs of support, webs of formation, and a stability to that. That's yes. So when you come up with that answer, please email me and let me know, because and email probably email you, Monsignor, email everyone that, we need to understand that better. But that was exactly a consequence of suburbanization, as the people moved out of those and started to mix and parishes became broader geographically, et cetera. Good question. Other questions, comments? Okay. Yes. I'm going to say 75 and a half, because Gorsuch was raised Catholic, but now he attends Anglican services, but we will still call him a Catholic. We'll count him. I'm sorry. I got you off.
Positions of power, do you believe it'd be a good idea if, Catholic individuals feel the inclination to go towards like CEO positions or public office? Would it be a good idea for them to pursue it in order to make real change in the economy, real change in the politicking of the world?
Absolutely. Everyone brings their values to the public table. The idea that, Catholics shouldn't be elected, because I don't even remember when Coney Barrett was up for appellate judge, was when Dianne Feinstein said, the dogma lives loudly in you. Well, I don't remember any of the Jewish nominees being asked that kind of question. Because some people would say, oh, well, I'm Protestant, or I'm non-denominational, or I'm not religious at all, so I'm not going to bring my values to the public square. We all bring our values to the public square. So Catholics have the right and the duty and the obligation to bring their values to the public square. But what's beautiful about that happening in a democracy is that they are at work in the marketplace of ideas. We have to persuade. We can't command, obviously. We have to persuade. And so we have to put our ideas, for those of us who are Catholic, or whatever faith tradition you might be, or none, you have to put your values out there too, into the marketplace of ideas. That makes us work harder. That makes us be more diligent and more educated about the issues. But absolutely, absolutely, people should. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions? We still have time? I don't know. Do we have time?
The last few minutes of our time together today, we're going to make a presentation of a very special award to Dr. Steve Nyhuisen. I'd like to invite Jane Mondoy, also a member of the Marianist Lecture Committee, formerly with the Diocese of Honolulu, up to make the presentation. Jane, please.
Friends, as we heard earlier this evening, the Mackey Award for Catholic Thought is given to the presenter in honor of Father Robert Mackey, the first president of Chaminade University, and who was an important voice in the civic and religious community of Honolulu. Steve, your prophetic work on the democratic experience of American Catholics, so eloquently and joyfully shared with us this evening, exemplifies the purpose of the Marianist lecture to advance the spirit, charism, and educational mission of the Society of Mary and the Marianist family. So with this, we present to you this umeke. So Steve, the umeke for us here in Hawaii is often the centerpiece of the family table. More than utilitarian, the umeke is a treasured symbol for feasting, sharing of meals. You could fit a lot of spam in that, I suppose. And the continuance of familial and cultural histories and values. Similarly, as we gather here on the slopes of Kalaipohaku as a Marianist family to feast upon your words and your wisdom, share in inclusive dialogue and in the context of our diverse cultures and values. We're inspired to make our church, our world, a better place through our prophetic witness. So it's our honor then to present you with this Mackey Award for Catholic Thought in recognition of your scholarly work, community and faith leadership, and for the thought-provoking challenges and beacons of hope presented to us today. Thank you.
Just very quick, I just want to thank the Society of Mary for giving me a home for 35 years in my teaching ministry, a home within their charism. And so to thank all the brothers of Mary who are here today. Thank you very much. And thank you for being here and listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. You've given us a lot to think about, and really appreciate very much the wonderful presentation. I'm sure there'll be other questions that we'll ruminate on in the days ahead. I want to thank our sponsors, Dr. Lynn Babington and Chaminade University and Brother Ed Brink for their support of this lecture series, Dr. Glenn Medeiros and St. Louis School, and Brother Ed Violet and the Marianist Center of Hawaii. I'd also like to thank the committee that plans and organizes this series, Dr. Helen Turner, whom you heard from, Jane Mondoy, and Dustin Regazas. So round of applause for them. Thank you. There's a number of people who have helped to arrange for the logistics for today. Yvonne, our ever faithful attendant here at Mystical Rose, does a lot of work behind the scenes. Thank you, Yvonne. And she keeps the volume right. Brother Peter Kiyama, who does the live streaming and general tech support. Thank you, Brother Peter. You'll meet Jane Chang because Jane is the assistant to Brother Ed, and she has arranged for our reception at Ching Hall immediately afterwards, so you'll meet her. And Kathy Chong. Kathy, where are you? Kathy? Oh, she left. Kathy is with University Communication and Marketing, so she did all of the promotion work for this. Kumu Kavika from St. Louis School for the Oli and the opening. And I'd like to thank in a special way Dr. Llewellyn Young and Deacon Keith Kabilis for promotion through their various systems for this. And for all of you who have joined us here in person and for those who have joined us online. Our next lecture will be on the 13th of October. So you can set your calendar. It's already set. And our speaker will be Teresa Lysot. She's a professor at the Neuswanger Institute for Bioethics and Medical Health Leadership and the Institute of Pastoral Studies from Loyola of Chicago. So she'll be here. Prior to joining the faculty at Loyola, she held tenure positions at Marquette and at the University of Dayton. In 2020, she was appointed to the Pontifical Academy for Life. So she'll be here to speak about life issues in October. Now, immediately afterwards, we have a reception at Ching Hall, Ching Conference Center. It's just out here, this first building to the right, second floor. There's some very nice drinks and poo-poos. So please join us for a bit of informal discussion and sharing. So I'd like to ask us now to stand and would like to conclude our day today with a song in honor of our Blessed Mother. And we'll end our time together, and please join us for the reception. If you know this, please join. I know the brothers do, so please join in if you can. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae, vita dulcedo. in hac lacrimam vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte. Et Iesu benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis